Thank you, Mr. Vishwanath. I'm just trying to now get to my presentation before I start off. There. I realize that we are running a bit late, and I won't want to keep all of you away from lunch, especially since some of the messages in the presentation may not be that palatable as well. But let me kind of just start off and first give you my disclaimer. This is something that my lawyers always ask me to put up, just to make sure that I don't go to jail for making this presentation. A lot of this presentation is about forecasts. A lot of this presentation is about what we think the future will look like. This is based on an exercise called the BP's Energy Outlook that we do for every year for the entire world, forecasted energy for the year 2035 for every part of the world. What I've tried to do is pick out some India pieces out of this, especially related to natural gas, that I think may have important lessons and understanding for where we are likely to end up with the current growth path. But just to kind of first give you a big picture, unlike most parts of the world where energy demand growth is slowing down, India is on the verge and on the cusp of industrialization. We expect Indian energy demand to be the fastest growing amongst all the BRIC countries, amongst all the developing world, especially of a country of this size. And a lot of this growth in energy consumption is going to come in the industrial sector. This is, I think, a large part of also the Make in India message, and this is also a large part of the message around what we heard in the morning about attracting industry, generating employment as well as economic activity. But the other side of the picture about where a lot of this energy demand is going to come from in terms of the sectors and fuels is also reflective of where India is today. Between the year 2013 and 2035, we expect a vast majority of the growth in energy consumption to happen in coal. Simply by virtue of the size of the sector, simply by virtue of the amount of resource that we have available in the nation. Coal growth in India outpaces coal growth in most parts of the world. In fact, we would soon expect India to become the world's largest importer of coal, a position that's currently held by China. The piece that I would also like to draw your attention to is this gradual and small growths that we are seeing in the red and the orange parts of the graph. This is sharp growth that we are seeing in natural gas consumption as well as renewables. In percentage terms, the growth in renewables in India is amongst the fastest in the world at about 9% per annum compared to a world average of about 6.5%. Our forecast of such a sharp increase in renewables growth is predicated on the kind of stories that we heard in the morning. We have a very vast resource potential, both solar and wind. The government is very actively considering exploiting this resource potential, and even if some of these plans, or a large majority of these plans, are actually realized, the outcomes can be very significant. Similarly for gas. But coming to the audience of this particular session, the electricity sector by itself is a fairly interesting piece. You see, over the last 50 odd years of our existence, the share of energy that goes into electricity generation and then is used for economic activity has gone up very rapidly, especially in the period of the last UPA government. The schemes like the Rajiv Gandhi Gram Vidyutikaran Yojana have pushed up the amount of primary energy that's going into electricity generation very sharply, and we are close to what the world average will be even 20 years from today. We are already at about 50% of total energy consumption going into electricity generation. But going forward, a lot of the growth in energy consumption will be led by industrialization itself and not just electricity generation. And within electricity generation, this is one sector where all fuels compete. There are very little technology barriers, there are some cost barriers, but they are coming to become lower and lower, and it's more easy for fuels to compete. And this is where we see coal to retain its dominance. Just again by virtue of the fact of where we are located and amount of the resource that we have available nationally as well as within the region. Then where does gas come into play? Let's take a step back from India and look at the world. Over the next 22 odd years, gas will be the fastest growing fuel in terms of world energy consumption. It will grow by just about 2% per annum for the next 22 odd years. But a fairly large part of this gas consumed will come from imported gas, will come from trade. And a very large proportion of this, about 88% of the total growth in gas trade, will come from LNG. Now, LNG is something that we are very familiar, at least in this part of the world, in this state. And the way we see LNG projects come online over the next 5 years or so is really remarkable. The next 5 years will comprise of about half of the total growth that we expect to see over the next 22 years. These are all these expensive projects in Australia, in East Africa, in the US and Canada that were commissioned and that were planned on and FID when the price of oil was $120. But since these commitments have been made, since these projects are under construction, we expect all of these projects to come online. So there will be this really huge growth spurt in the amount of LNG that's available in the market. This is something that we've seen over the last 6 months in our part of the world as well, where natural gas prices have fallen down quite considerably. This is effectively a situation of LNG supply glut. But gradually, over time, over the next 7 years, growth in places like India, China, Indonesia catches up with this growth in LNG supply, and the surplus is absorbed, and we have a period of more steady growth coming back. And how does this affect India? We expect a large majority of the growth in gas consumption in India to happen in the industrial sector. A sector which in general and in most cases is able to pay for and afford more expensive gas, which is where the role of slightly cheaper LNG becomes increasingly important. Over the next 5-7 years or so, the share of LNG in our total gas consumption basket will rise to about 60-odd%. We've had a period of stagnating and declining gas production nationally, and this situation will take a fairly long period of time to rectify. And this kind of a situation will also take fairly strong efforts on part of the government to provide incentives as well as some assurances to investors to come and invest. Nevertheless, I am perhaps a less cautious economist than Mr. Vishwanath, and certainly retain the optimism that at some point people are going to look at the newspapers and realize we have all of these resources lying under our ground, and we'll ask the government, why are we not extracting these and getting expensive LNG instead? And as that happens, growth in production comes back with some amount of regulatory and pricing reforms. And the share of consumption that's met by total domestic production itself comes back to about 50-odd%. But nevertheless, make no mistake, we are in a period of lower LNG prices for a bit, and that allows domestic industrial consumption to exploit the situation quite extensively. And this should give you a sense of where everyone in the world expects LNG prices to be globally. The whole range of estimates comparing a low-end scenario of about $8 per MMBTU to a high-end scenario of about $12 per MMBTU, where all of these are 2014 real prices, where one expects LNG prices to gradually settle. This is still a fairly expensive proposition compared to perhaps what domestic coal provides. Hence the challenge that the electricity sector has to be able to afford this expensive gas. But if you were to take a step back and see how much of this gas do we have nationally available, this is an exercise that IHS did a little while back, a couple of years back, where they estimated amongst the various basins in India how much gas is actually available. And their estimates are in some ways brilliant. India has 90 TCF of gas, but this costs a lot of money to get out of the ground. It costs $12 odd plus. But comparing it with the picture above, It certainly is a cheaper proposition to get this domestic gas out of the ground instead of importing this expensive LNG. So the question then comes to a policymaker and to industry particularly is which of these alternatives are you more willing to go for? And when we do things like the energy outlook and a forecast like this, the objective is, and frankly, never realizable that I'll get the estimates right to the perfect decimal point. But the objective really is to identify what are the forks in the road, what are the challenges and constraints and fault lines in our future, what are the points at which we will have to make choices about where we go. And this picture reflects one of those choices that we have to make. Looking at a mix of domestic as well as imported gas, one needs to also recognize that pooling this gas and then supplying it on a merchant basis probably is a great way of dealing with it. You would have to have an aggregator, a merchant supplier, who's able to do this in a manner that's also competitive, so that one merchant supplier is competing against several other merchant suppliers. And this kind of an opportunity should also be recognized in a way that allows for domestic production to realize the vast resource potential that we've clearly identified for this country. Nevertheless, the fact that there is an imported option available does also increase energy security. I'd like to remind this audience, energy security is not the same thing as energy self-sufficiency. Having a clear, dedicated, well-functioning, competitive and efficient supply line, whether domestic or imported, offers security. If Japan did not have an import line into their country when Fukushima happened, the lights would have gone off in Tokyo. But the end outcome in most cases would be to have competition. As long as there is competition, domestic suppliers, LNG importers, as well as merchant aggregators will be able to provide hopefully an optimal and efficient outcome for the country. Thank you.